The night Chicago burned did not begin with an explosion or a scream. It began with an ordinary sound, so small and domestic that no one thought it could end a city: the soft crackle of fire touching dry wood. On October 8, 1871, the wind moved gently at first, as if testing the streets, slipping through alleys and over rooftops, brushing against a city built in a hurry and made mostly of timber. Chicago had been growing faster than its own imagination. In less than 4 decades, it had transformed from a muddy frontier outpost into a booming industrial hub, a place where railroads converged, cattle were slaughtered by the thousands, and fortunes were made by men who believed the future belonged to speed. That future arrived that night in the form of flames. No one can say with certainty where the fire truly started. Legend would later blame a cow belonging to Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant whose barn on DeKoven Street became a convenient symbol for everything Chicago wanted to forget about itself: poverty, immigrants, and chaos. The truth is more complicated and far less comfortable. The city was a tinderbox long before that barn ever existed. Sidewalks were wooden, streets were wooden, roofs were wooden. Even the riverbanks were lined with lumber yards stacked high like offerings to disaster. The summer of 1871 had been brutally dry. Rain had barely touched the city for months. Firefighters were exhausted from battling smaller blazes, their equipment worn, their horses tired. Chicago did not need a villain, it needed only a spark. When the fire alarm sounded, it did not ring with urgency. Dispatchers sent the wrong crews in the wrong direction. By the time the mistake was realized, the flames had already leapt from structure to structure, feeding on pine and oak as if the city itself were fuel. Wind rose suddenly, violently, pushing the fire eastward. Embers flew like birds, landing blocks away, igniting new infernos faster than men could react. Firewalls collapsed, water pressure failed. The city's pride, its confidence that it could control nature through grit and ambition, evaporated in the heat. People ran with what they could carry. Some grabbed money, others photographs, others nothing at all. Families became separated in the chaos, shouting names that were swallowed by smoke. Horses screamed, dogs broke loose, churches filled with refugees until the churches themselves caught fire. The wealthy fled alongside the poor, discovering in the streets that class meant nothing when the sky itself was burning. The fire crossed the Chicago River, something experts had believed impossible. When it did, hope died with it. The river was not a barrier, it was another path. For 2 days and nights, Chicago burned. Nearly 3 square miles were destroyed. More than 17,000 buildings vanished. An estimated 100,000 people, almost 1/3 of the city, were left homeless. Officially, around 300 people died, though many historians believe the true number was far higher, lost in the ruins and unrecorded among the poor and undocumented. When rain finally fell and the fire collapsed into smoking rubble, Chicago looked like a war zone. Iron rails lay twisted, stone buildings cracked open like eggs. The air smelled of ash and wet soot. Silence settled in, heavy and unreal. America watched in disbelief. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco printed illustrations of a city erased. Donations poured in from across the nation and from Europe. Food, clothing, money, and volunteers arrived by train. The disaster became one of the first national humanitarian responses in U.S. history, a moment when Americans began to see themselves as connected not just by railroads and markets, but by shared responsibility. Yet even in sympathy, judgment followed. Critics blamed Chicago's corruption, its reckless growth, its immigrant neighborhoods. The myth of Mrs. O'Leary's cow spread quickly because it offered a simple story: a careless woman caused a catastrophe. It spared the city from confronting its deeper failures. In the ashes, something unexpected happened. Chicago refused to die. Instead, it did what it had always done. It rebuilt,
faster and bolder than before. City leaders rewrote building codes almost immediately. Wood construction in the downtown core was banned. Brick, stone, and eventually steel replaced timber. Architects and engineers arrived with radical ideas. They saw not ruins, but opportunity. From this moment emerged the foundations of modern urban America. Men like William LeBaron Jenney began experimenting with steel frame construction, allowing buildings to rise higher than ever imagined. The skyscraper was not born from luxury or ego, it was born from disaster and necessity. Land in the rebuilt city was valuable. Going upward made sense. Chicago became a laboratory where architecture met ambition, where mistakes had consequences measured in lives and history. The fire also reshaped how Americans thought about cities. Before Chicago burned, fire damage was seen as local tragedies. Afterward, they were recognized as national threats. Fire departments professionalized, insurance industries transformed. Urban planning slowly began to consider safety, sanitation, and resilience. The lessons were written in ash, but they were learned. Yet the human cost lingered long after the buildings rose again. Immigrant families who had lost everything were often pushed further to the margins, their neighborhoods redeveloped without them. Wealthy property owners recovered quickly through insurance and investment. Inequality, like the fire, spread unevenly. Chicago's rebirth was powerful, but it was not fair. The city's skyline became a symbol of progress, even as its streets told quieter stories of displacement and loss. Catherine O'Leary lived long enough to see the myth of her guilt harden into legend. She denied it until her death, and years later a reporter would confess to inventing the cow story to satisfy public appetite for blame. The city eventually exonerated her, but only after she was gone. Her story reveals another truth about disasters. Societies search for simple explanations to avoid facing complex responsibility.
By the end of the 19th century, Chicago stood taller than ever. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 showcased a gleaming vision of American power and order, deliberately contrasting the chaos of the fire 2 decades earlier. Visitors marveled at electric lights, grand boulevards, and monumental buildings. Few could imagine that this triumph was built on a foundation of tragedy. The Great Chicago Fire did more than destroy a city. It accelerated the future. It forced America to confront the consequences of unchecked growth and the illusion of control. It proved that disaster could be both an ending and a beginning. In the smoke-filled darkness of 1871, Chicago lost its past. In rebuilding, it helped invent the modern American city. Even today, when glass towers reflect the sky and tourists photograph the river that once carried fire across its surface, the story remains embedded in the streets. Every fire code, every steel beam, every emergency siren carries an echo of that night when ordinary flames became extraordinary destiny. Chicago did not rise despite the fire, it rose because of it. And in that uncomfortable truth lies one of the most surprising lessons in American history. Sometimes destruction is the catalyst that forces a nation to grow up.